Okay, so I'm Tanya Wright. I'm in the Department of Teacher Education at Michigan State University. I am a faculty in language and literacy, and my area of focus is early language and literacy, sort of. I'm a former kindergarten teacher. Then I got my PhD at U of M. Anne-Marie is actually one of my teachers, getting on to be about a decade ago now. So I'm super excited that she was talking to you this morning. My area of research that I really focus on are children's knowledge development and language development, oral language development, and how those relate to their literacy development. And what's really interesting about that is I've always sort of done my research in the context of science. In part because if we want kids to develop language and knowledge, it needs to be around something, right? Kids need something to talk about. And I think that, and always have thought that science is a very special opportunity to support kids' learning, particularly in the grades I'm interested in, which is pre-K through 2. And I'll tell you a little bit more about some of my work today. Right now, my big project I'm working on is actually a National Science Foundation. That's why I said early language and literacy-ish, an NSF project. And I'm working with Amelia Gottwals, who's in science at Michigan State. And what we're working on are sort of a 3-part project. We're working on NGSS-aligned curriculum materials for K through 2. We have the whole kindergarten year already that integrate language and literacy. They're called Solid Start, Science, Oral Language, Literacy Development from the start of school. Another part of this project is working on an observational tool to support high-quality sense-making talk in K through 2 classrooms in science. And this observational tool is aligned with an online professional development that we're developing. So someday I will come and talk to you about all of that. Today I'm here to talk to you about the K3 Literacy Essentials document. And I want to give you an overview of what that document is, why it was developed, how it relates to what's going on in the state. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about Essentials 7. Which is the part I just found out about. So I'm I'm just going to talk fast. Stop me with questions anytime. I love questions. I'm not upset by questions. If I'm confusing, I want to answer the questions. So the original goals of today's presentation were why were the Essentials documents developed, how were the Essentials documents developed, and how should the Essentials documents be used. And we'll do an add-on a little bit about Essentials 7 because that's a particular point of contact between these essential documents and science instruction in our state. But actually, I'm going to point out some other places that I think are points of contact. So the rationale behind developing these documents, and now there are actually, we started with K3. There's a pre-K document, a literacy coaches document. I'll show you where to find all of this in a minute. There is a school-wide document. There's a 4 through 6 document. Are the adolescent documents there yet?
4 or 5 is there, not 6.
No, okay, 4 or 5 is there. There's not adolescent yet. So I'm blocking my own. Give me 1 second. I'm blocking my own presentation. Okay, so as you may or may not be aware of, right, there's concern about kids' literacy development in our state. This is this year's MSTEP data, as well as it's 2015, 2016, 2017, all the grades, right, 3rd through 8th. Right here is the line between what we consider proficient and not proficient in kids' literacy development on MSTEP, okay? And so while you will often see in the newspapers, like, kids in Michigan gained 4 points or lost 4 points, right? If you kind of look at this line across the grades, across the years, we're sort of hovering around 50% of kids being considered proficient by the measures developed in our state, okay? On our 2016 MSTEP results, of the students in Michigan who were eligible for free and reduced lunch, only 29% scored proficient or advanced, right? So as a state, we're hovering around 50%, but that 50% is not everybody, right, across all demographic groups. And of the students in Michigan not eligible for free and reduced lunch, so our more advantaged students, right, economically advantaged students, 60% proficient or advanced, okay? Guys might have seen some of this in the news recently, right? Michigan test score gains worst in nation. This is our NAEP, or Nations Report Card data. You might have looked at it for science, but I'll talk a little bit about literacy today. This was actually a study that showed we were the best at getting worse. So in other words, our scores were dropping more than any other state in literacy. Okay. I'll just show you a little bit. Hopefully this will work to click on it. You never know. So this is where I'm looking, okay? So this is the Nations Report Card data, and what this is an assessment in literacy that's given, they sample from across the country, right? So everyone, no matter where you are, is getting the same assessment. So that lets us say, if you're a kid in Michigan, how do you do on this assessment? Whether or not we agree with the assessment, right? We can at least compare on one single assessment across the states, right? Which is really different to our individual state tests, which might be different from one another, so it makes comparing really hard. So what this lets us do, but of course, I'm not going to be able to do it because, oh, there we go. So what this lets us do is we can look at how our state compares to other states, but it'll take a second for the internet to work. Okay, so I'm going to just click on Michigan for you guys. Just get a sense. This is very hard to do. Okay, one more second. All right, there we are. And we are able to look at how we compare to the other states in the country. Have you guys ever been on this? Okay, so everyone can get on this, right? It's public data. You can play. They have science assessment data too. So you can see how we do in science. So this is really important to know about. It's nationsreportcard.gov, okay? And you can do here state comparisons. Okay, so now we're in, we want to pick I'm going to do 4th grade reading because that's what we're talking about today, okay? And this lets us see how kids in Michigan are doing in early reading compared to kids across the nation, okay? And this is the only way we really have to do this, because it's the one test that's sampling across the states, across kids, okay? So here is the state comparisons. Here are the states that we know do well, like Massachusetts, right? They're always held out as a state that does well. Here we go. Can you see? Am I blocking? We're still going. There's Michigan. Okay. So compared to other kids across the country, we are not doing so well, right, in our state in early literacy, okay? This lets me compare student groups in Michigan, okay? So let's look at kids in Michigan who identify as Black, and this is self-identify on the test, right? We can compare how kids who identify as Black in Michigan do in early reading compared to kids who identify as Black in other states. Here we go. We're at the very, very, very bottom. Okay. And we are at the very, very, very bottom for kids who identify as free and reduced lunch and all sorts of other categories. Okay, so while our own state data tells us 50% of our kids are doing great and 50% aren't, and it looks kind of the same, when we compare nationally, it's pretty much, for many groups of kids, worse to be growing up in Michigan than any other state as far as education. Okay. So this is very, very, very concerning, I hope, data to everybody. And you can all look at it and play on it as much as you want afterwards. I'm just going to come back to my PowerPoint, if I can. Give me 1 second. There we go. Okay, So that's the nation's report card. And so obviously everyone in our state is kind of concerned about this data. And they should be concerned about this data, okay? And so whether you agree with the test and what the test is measuring, or you don't agree with the test and what the test is measuring as evidence of literacy development, it is sort of concerning that kids in our state do worse than most other states on this. And this has been making the news, and this has been of concern across the state. Many of you know we have a literacy law in our state. This year's kindergartners, if they don't pass the state assessments when they're in 3rd grade, are eligible for retention. Okay, so again, whether you agree with the law or not, that's the law in our state right now. So as you would imagine, folks are very concerned about kids' literacy development in the early grades of school. So this is the context. Actually, the law was not the law yet. When a whole group of educational stakeholders from across Michigan started getting together to try to figure out if there was sort of a grassroots effort that could be made to work on literacy instruction in Michigan. The Early Literacy Task Force was formed as part of the Michigan Association of Independent School Administrators, MESA, and that is the ISD superintendents across the state. So those folks said, we've got to do something about this. Let's get interested stakeholders together from all sorts of organizations, right? There's a list on the back of the K-3 Essentials. Hopefully they copied this part because I think it's important. But there are representatives from many of the ISDs, the elementary school principals, the Michigan Reading Association, various universities, MDE, right? All sorts of stakeholders were on this group, were part of this group. And the other part of the context that was happening is that there was funding for ISD literacy coaches across the state. Not much funding and not many of them, but some, okay? And one question was, if you're going to have these coaches, well, what are they going to coach on? What are they going to coach about? What are they going to do? Okay? So that is just all the context for the development of these essentials. And so this group of representatives got together and they thought, well, one thing we could do is we could come up with a small set of research-supported instructional practices that could be the focus of professional development throughout the state. So one thing the group noted is that every single district school seems to be doing their own thing, and clearly that is not effective. Maybe we can all learn together about what are the big things that we should all be working on that might support kids' literacy development in Michigan. So that's on page 1 of the document, if you want to follow along. I'm going to go through a little bit of the front matter here. Okay. So the big thing this group decided to do was focus on research, right? So that each one of the 10 major practices, and those are what's in green here, okay, needed to have been shown to have a positive effect on kids' literacy development. Okay. And why did we want to focus on research? Okay, and I might be sort of telling a group that already know these things, but I just want to say it, right? We really wanted to know that these practices were better for kids than something else, right? So we looked at studies that were experimental or quasi-experimental. In other words, whatever practice made it in here was compared to something else and shown to be more effective for kids' literacy development. Okay? We also used meta-analysis, which is a statistical way of pooling the data on various studies to try to give evidence that these practices are really important. Because if we were going to pick 10 practices to say we need professional development around this for our whole state, we wanted them to be very important and based on research, right? And based on relatively new research, right? So one thing we wanted to make sure it was up to date. Sometimes we go into schools and we say to teachers, why are you doing that? And they said, I learned it in my teacher prep program 20 years ago, and it's always worked for me, right? And if you were sick and you went to a doctor and they said, I'm sorry, you can't have the most recent treatment we know about because I'm just going to give you the one I learned in medical school 20 years ago because it's always worked for me, you would run away screaming and write them up on Google reviews or something, right? That would not be okay with you. But sometimes that is what flies in schools. So we were really trying to focus on research that had been effective across a broad range of groups, where there's really evidence that these practices were likely to help kids' literacy. Questions so far? Okay. So a really important kind of caveat to that point I just said about the importance of focusing on research, right, is that one thing it says in there is new literacy research could alter or add to the research practices recommended, right? So this is the best we could figure out, this big group of people, in this particular moment when it was written, but every year there's new studies that might show us something new or change something we know, and so, you know, the document is the best of what we knew in that current moment. So if you've ever written a document where you tried to focus on 10 and only 10 really important practices that you thought would really make a difference for kids in Michigan in their literacy with like 30 of your closest friends, 30 people you've never met before and sat in a room, and everybody has ideas about what's important and what should be in there, and then the researchers were going back into the research to see if there was evidence for things people wanted to be in there. So this was some people in this room were part of this process, very iterative process, very sort of like a humbling process, right? Because everyone would want their favorite thing in there, and then we maybe wouldn't have the evidence as of yet to put it in there. So, and every single word usually has some sort of meaning that's in here. Okay. And I'll say one last thing about basing on research is, right, teachers have a lot to offer from their anecdotal experiences, right? And that's not the type of research we included in here. But sometimes our anecdotal experiences lead us in the wrong direction, right? And we have a lot of evidence for that, right? So for example, for a long time from anecdotal experience, people thought dyslexia was a visual processing difficulty where kids saw letters backwards, right? And it took research, it took actually neuroimaging research to teach us that that's not the case, right? Kids who have dyslexia see letters just like everybody else. In fact, they have some challenges with phonological processing, right? Which is the ability to understand that language is broken down into individual sounds, right? So there are things like this that benefit from, the benefit of using research is we have some evidence for the claims we're making in this document, right, that we think they're going to be effective because we've seen that they are. Okay, a few other really important things about how this document was put together and what it's supposed to be. So one thing on page 1, it says, the idea is that these 10 essential instructional practices happen in every classroom every day. So it's not meant to be a menu of options like, well, I can do read alouds, but I'm really not going to group kids to provide instruction based on what they need. Read alouds is essential 2, and grouping kids is essential 3, okay? So it's not intended to be a menu, it's intended to be things that are important for kids in all classrooms every day. It's intended, and it says this in the document, as in practice guides in medicine, as presenting a minimum standard of care for Michigan's children. So of course this doesn't mean that we can't do more, right? Or more interesting things, or exciting projects where we use literacy, right? There's a lot we can do beyond the scope of this document or integrating this document. But this is meant to be at minimum what our kids deserve in their instruction. It says within a variety of overall approaches to literacy instruction and within many different structures of the school day. The document does not specify a particular program or approach to literacy instruction. So as many of you know, there are different literacy programs and different approaches across our state, and we're saying, do an audit. Whatever your program or approach is, if it doesn't have all these 10 things happening for kids every day, it's probably not giving kids what they need in their literacy development. And the study I put here is actually a study where they assigned curricula, programs, to different schools, okay? And they wanted to compare. It was sort of like a horse race. Which of these is the best? And what they found, for moving kids' literacy development, okay? And what they found is more difference from teacher to teacher within a program than from program to program. And you guys are all professional, you work on professional development, you know this, right? So we can hand the same curriculum, hand the same materials to a school full of teachers, and some of them are going to be able to make use of those as tools to support kids' learning, and others less so, right? There's going to be a big variability. So that's one of the reasons that this document focuses on practices rather than a particular curriculum or a particular philosophy, right? Because we're saying there's certain practices that have been shown to be good for kids, no matter what the curriculum you name. Okay. It suggests, and here's where we get to sort of points of contact with science instruction, that these should occur throughout the day. Okay? So what that means is that we're actually not advocating for a bigger and bigger and bigger literacy block that bullies everything else out of the curriculum, right? We're interested in literacy integrated across in this case, K-3 day. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay? It says in there, should be integrated into opportunities for science and social studies learning. So that's really important and right up front. Not exclusively in an isolated block identified as English language arts or literacy. Okay? And should not take the place of science and social studies, because in the long term, this approach is counterproductive. Later academic achievement is predicted not only by literacy, knowledge, and skills. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that's in there. But this is just one study, and I'm wondering if Anne-Marie shared the same study. But I'll share it with you as an example, okay? So this was a study where they actually looked at kids who knew a lot about baseball and kids who knew less about baseball. And they gave them, and some of these kids were really strong readers by whatever, the assessment that was measuring their reading. And some of these kids were not very strong readers. And they assessed kids' comprehension of this text about baseball. And it turns out, perhaps not surprisingly, the kids who knew a lot about baseball and were really good readers were the best at reading this passage, okay? That's not a shocker. But after that, the next best kids at reading the passage were the kids who knew a lot about baseball and were less strong readers. Because what we know about a topic is one of the biggest predictors of our ability to comprehend text around that topic. And that shouldn't be surprising to you. When you took a college class, right, and you got the syllabus the first couple of weeks, you read all the stuff, it didn't mean a lot to you. But as you read into that topic and knew more about it and had deeper and deeper learning, it all started to make sense, right? You started to be able to make connections you couldn't make at first. You were able to understand something you didn't understand at first, okay? So, that is some of the rationale, right? A big part of the rationale that this document advocates for loss of time, for content area learning, and including literacy as part of that content area learning. And you guys are going to be my guinea pigs today because I'm trying out a new text for this experiment. I've done this activity a lot of times, but I've never done it with this particular one because I decided I needed something fresh and new. So this is an opportunity to just play with the idea that knowledge or knowledge of topic might matter for literacy development. So here's a text, and I'm going to read it to you, or you can read it, and you can read it to yourself, and I want you to think about what you might know or have to be able to do in order to successfully read and comprehend. I have no interest in being able to say the words and not know what it means. Why would anyone do that, right? So read and comprehend this passage. This is a passage from the New York Times obituary of Stephen Hawking this year, okay? So it's text that is available for the public, right? Adults and the public to read. And I will read it to you, and then maybe you can turn and talk about some of the things you might have to be able to do, okay? So it says, it also meant that black holes had a temperature and had entropy. In thermodynamics, entropy is a measure of wasted heat, but it is also a measure of the amount of information, the number of bits, needed to describe what is in a black hole. Curiously, the number of bits is proportional to the black hole's surface area, not its volume, meaning that the amount of information you could stuff into a black hole is limited by its area, not, as one might think, its volume. That result has become a litmus test for string theory and other pretenders to a theory of quantum gravity. It has also led to speculations that we live in a holographic universe in which three-dimensional space is some kind of illusion. Okay? So if you could turn and talk to your partner about what it would take to read and comprehend that passage, that would be great. All right, so there's some really great conversations going on about this text and what it means. What do you have to know and be able to do to read and comprehend this text? And there's not one answer, there are many answers, so let's hear some of them. What is something you have to know and be able to do?
You have to know the words, but...
What do you mean by know the words?
Well, like, you have to know, what temperature is, or entropy.
Okay, so you're saying know the meanings of the words in there, yep,
Not
something
just
about
the
them.
meanings, though, because the meanings aren't enough. I mean, you have to have something else to attach those words to.
So you need some conceptual understanding of those words.
Yes.
Right. And I would say that that is the meaning of those words, because just a definition is rarely a meaning of the word, and I'll get to that in a second, right?
Contextual meanings of the words.
Right.
The word string and the word theory.
Right. Right. You also need contextual meaning to the word in this particular case. How about litmus test, right? Like there's one that they're using more in a different way, right, to the actual litmus test you maybe did in chemistry class, right? Okay. What else?
Decoding.
Okay, I did the decoding part for you, but you obviously just have to be able to like say the words, look at the symbols and squiggles and lines on the paper and say them. So that's a big thing. What else? Yeah.
I think you have to really understand the underlying scientific concepts of multiple different ones to even make sense of it, because what they're doing is they're pulling, several different ideas and concepts and kind of merging them.
Right, so there have been different bodies of knowledge, scientific bodies of knowledge, and also mathematical, a lot of mathematical bodies of knowledge in there, yeah?
I was asking myself a lot of questions within that.
Okay.
So I was questioning while I was reading.
Okay, so maybe so good readers use strategies to support their own comprehension, particularly on a very difficult text, right? So you might ask yourself questions or attempt to summarize or try to figure out what a word means that you might not know, because you're just trying to help yourself in the best ways you can. Okay, go ahead.
I think it's also your purpose as a reader, right? The level of understanding. Because what made the hair on the back of my neck go up is the word pretenders. And it kind of brought me back to when I read the string theory of that you read and understand to a certain level, and then you've realized everything they've said up to that point reconciles with the understanding of science. So this part, which is totally beyond me, I believe from faith, right?
Right. So, okay.
So when reading it, there's your knowledge to test it versus the faith in the author.
Right, okay, so you're trying to integrate what you read with your own knowledge base in some way, or not, right? Or just hope that they're telling you something that is useful information, which we don't know, right? So there's some also evaluation of the author's purpose and the author themselves, right? Like we joke in my house that the way I have learned to read as an academic is I don't read anything till I know who the author is yet first, right? The first thing I'll check is the biography of the author before, even when I read the New York Times, I'm like, who wrote this? And that gives me some indication of what they're probably up to, okay? Anything else that stands out? Anyone for whom this was like a really easy thing to read? That's good. I watch a lot of Big Bang Theory, and I don't understand any of this.
I'm a physics faculty member.
Okay, so I knew there would be someone. I knew there'd be a ringer in the audience, right? Okay, so I gave this to you, right, because it's likely challenging, right? And this is the experience kids are in when they're reading, right? And I don't have to give them a New York Times physics text to put them in that experience of reading something challenging. So you mentioned many of these areas, but the next part of the document lists some of the areas of kids' literacy development that these instructional practices support. So when I said there's evidence that the instructional practices in here support kids' learning, it can be on one of these many areas. And I'm just going to go through a few of them that we know are important for kids' literacy development. Okay? Oral language, including vocabulary. Basically, if you don't understand it when someone says it to you, you're very unlikely to understand it when you read it in a text. Okay? Maybe even less likely. Okay? Print concepts. This is for our very young readers, understanding how text works. That if we're reading in English, we're reading from left to right, and then we sweep back to the next line, knowing how to turn the pages of a book. All of that is very new to our youngest learners, so we have to help them with that. Phonological awareness is that our oral language can be broken down into smaller and smaller sounds, all the way down to phonemes, which are the sounds we map onto letters. So k-at maps onto C-A-T. Okay, those are phonemes. Alphabet knowledge and other letter sound knowledge, which is sometimes called phonics. So that's which letters map onto which sounds, and that says including larger orthographic units. That's like O-U-G-H means O when you read the word though, okay? Word analysis strategies. So when you get to a word you don't know, what are some strategies that you have for what to do? Okay. Reading fluency, so being able to read that passage so it sounds like sort of fluent, right? How speech or text should sound. Okay. And I did that. I got to do that part for you, but I had to practice a few times. Okay. Handwriting and word processing. So in the same way we need the text kids to code to be fluent enough that they can understand it, we need them to be able to write or type fluently enough that they can convey their ideas. Okay. Broad content and background knowledge, and you all mentioned that, right? Because you're always integrating what you read into with what you know. Knowledge and abilities required to comprehend text. Some of you mentioned having comprehension strategies like asking yourself questions to support yourself, but also knowledge about the genre of the text or the structure that the text is using, right, is really important for helping kids to comprehend text. Knowledge and abilities related to composing text, right? We don't want kids just to be able to be consumers of text, but we want them to be able to write for various purposes. Literacy, motivation, and engagement. Someone at the back there was like, I wouldn't want to read this anyway, right? So I would just stop. Okay. So again, if you have no purpose, if you're not engaged in reading, that impacts your reading, right? And vocabulary strategies, particularly morphology. So it's not that we just need kids to know the meaning of words or even have big concepts about the meaning of the words, but we need them to have some ways of figuring out word meanings when they don't know them. Right? So there were some definitely words in there that you could use the parts of the word, thermo, right, and dynamics, to try to figure out something, right? You wouldn't know everything, but something to help you with this word. Okay? So that is sort of like the many areas of literacy development that are addressed in these 10 essentials, and different essentials focus more or less on some different ones of them. And the last thing I want to say, because this is a going thing in our state, and you're going to hear it a lot, people say kids just need 5 things for literacy. If they can be readers if they just have 5 things, right? The 5 important things that you have to do every day, and then kids will be strong readers, okay? And I mentioned those 5 things in that last list. That's the top list. And they come from the National Reading Panel in 2000, okay? And the National Reading Panel was a meta-analysis, which means they needed a lot of a certain type of study, an experimental study, in order to include them in that. And they came up with 5 areas of literacy development where we happen to have a lot of research, enough to do a meta-analysis and show effects. But what they didn't include in there, just because at that time they didn't have what they needed, were other important areas for literacy development, like conceptual knowledge that you all just talked about, motivation, writing, so they were really focused on reading. So there's a lot that this addresses that are beyond 5 things. Okay. All right. So based on that passage we just read, and also the baseball study I told you about, and also what Anne-Marie told you this morning, here's a thing that has happened and is happening and continues to happen in our state. A principal tells you they're reducing time on science and social studies in K-3 to focus on the literacy essentials. Turn to your partner and talk about what you say, not just from how could you be convincing not just as an advocate of science, but as an advocate of science and literacy and science.
Understanding how to sense around us. And laws is from content knowledge, but it is. And so, if you're taking away the knowledge of well, I was experiencing all the way to ask a question. That's like when I have comprehension skills, and I know you're talking like text. And it just gives me this document. I so that's no one's ever sat down and had to define
to stop that once they're not giving you information. Because they would be quick to comply with that, knowing that they don't want to teach you.
Okay, so clearly I'm not surprised that people in this room feel passionately about this topic. Let me just bring you back, right? As you all know very well, because it's sort of already happened, right? And now we're kind of pushing back from that, is this idea, this like sort of basic skills first kind of idea, right? That has permeated the early grades of school. And I'll tell you that my opinion is it's the worst thing that has happened for kids, not just for their science instruction, which of course it's the worst thing for, because if you don't have science, you're not going to be doing science, but also for their literacy development that we can think of happening for kids. Because every time we look at what matters most for kids' literacy development, it's knowledge, right? Knowledge is one of the biggest drivers of what lets you know what you can read and comprehend and what you can't read and comprehend. So if you have a principal who's trying to promote kids' literacy development, and the idea of how to do that is to take out science, that person is not understanding how to promote kids' literacy development. Go ahead.
So I know a lot of administrators who have this document, and I can't figure out how, like you say that, and that's very easy to say, but I feel like, how do you break the block? It's like I keep finding this, like, what is it? Because they have this document,
Right.
and yet they ignore the document.
Yep. So, I mean, the only thing I can say is that we're running around the state like crazy people, trying to share this information. I mean, I can't tell you how many parts of Michigan, Laurel's laughing at me and Brandy back there because they've been a part of a lot of this, working with coaches, working with administrators, working with superintendents, working with the testing people. I've been to all their conferences. So I think step one is education. Step two is what I'm going to show you next. Really in-depth understanding of how it might look to do something different. So I think when you just advocate for something different, but people don't know what to replace it with, they don't make a change, right? So we need to have opportunities to show and tell a different way, okay? And that certainly is my research work, right? But I think also I'm going to show you some of the materials that are available now to actually show and tell more. Okay, go ahead.
You know, I listened to one of the candidates for governor just the other day, and the phrase out of her mouth was, everybody knows, learn to read, then read to learn.
Oh.
Right, and the people in here cringe at that, but it sounds so logical and right.
Right.
And it's so easy.
So let me tell you about that phrase, which is the least favorite phrase in my whole world, and I think it's one of the things that's broken literacy instruction and also all instruction in our state. These guys know. Anytime someone mentions it, I go crazy. I just wrote an American Educator article that's for hopefully coming out sometime soon. That's for American Federation of Teachers, so it's anyone who's in that union hopefully will read it. All about why this phrase is problematic and a big, big problem for lots of reasons. First, that phrase is just catchy, right? That's why people say it. Yeah. It's inaccurate from a literacy perspective and how we think about kids learning. First of all, from the moment you read with a baby and they start to turn the pages on an Eric Carle book, right? They are learning to read because they're learning how text works, right? And they are reading to learn. They're learning something about the world from reading, right? And that continues throughout. And in fact, kids can learn so much by engaging with text, right? Reading, well before they can do the decoding independently. And they need adults to support them by reading text to them well beyond when they can read independently, because the first books kids read independently are like, the ice cream is red, the ice cream is yellow, the ice cream is blue. Those aren't learning experiences other than to practice decoding. They're purposely controlled to be easy, so that conceptually easy, right? So also, there's evidence that people become better readers throughout their life. Graduate students are better readers than undergrads, and in part, that is driven by this knowledge finding, right? The more in-depth you know your area, the better you are as a reader in that area. Okay, so that phrase is wrong from start to end. People like how it says, I always say to audience, never, ever, ever say it again. And if you ever hear someone say it, try to get them to stop, because it's just wrong in every way for how we conceptualize literacy and also learning. And it's very problematic, and I just feel like it's like people want it because it rhymes, right, or something. Okay. Go ahead.
I think I also have a bit of a concern with the phrase content knowledge.
Okay.
And I think my struggle with that is that the idea, I think, and it may be related to the, reading to learn idea, the idea that we get content knowledge by reading a science picture book,
okay.
or by, and those kids in the study about baseball most likely got their knowledge about baseball by playing baseball.
Right.
Right, experiencing it.
Right.
And especially when we're talking elementary kids,
Right.
like as we get older, we can read a lot and learn a lot about a thing. It's still not the
Right.
same experiences,
Right.
Like your idea with your
So I am totally on team experience. I don't argue at all, right? I would argue for both. I would say there are things you can, like, if you grew up in Michigan and you've never been to the ocean and the chances of you going to the ocean are very slim, it's great that we have books and videos about the ocean, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't learn things by having fish in your classroom, right? So I think that texts have a special role of giving kids experiences beyond what we can bring into their classroom. Texts have a great role of some of the work we do is we try to talk to kids about how scientists use texts, including graphic images, right, or models. So there is room for text in the different disciplines in different ways. In literacy research, right, which is a different vein of research, and one of the things I've learned is, right, sometimes you're just talking from different theories, from different research perspectives. It's a great question, right? In these studies, it doesn't matter how that knowledge got to you, it's that having the knowledge that matters for reading, right? Because nobody is measuring that. One could do a study that said if you learned about baseball from doing baseball versus from reading about baseball, which one actually helped you when you were reading something about baseball? But nobody's ever done a racehorse study like that for literacy. Okay, probably because, well, what if the results were? Nobody wants to do that, right? It's not, because what we want to say is yes and, both and, right? Go ahead.
I think the disconnect though is when your conclusion is how does it help you understand about reading of baseball, whereas in science how would it help you hit a ball?
There you go.
And
Right.
So
Right. So that
reading is
exactly.
a tool to help you be able to
Right.
understand science.
Exactly. So, right, you are talking about knowing about stuff for the purposes of reading versus knowing about the stuff for doing science are likely to very different outcomes.
But you use reading.
Right. And so there's a very big pushback and for good reasons, right, about the idea of reading replacing doing science. And that's happening all over, especially in elementary schools, where if you read an informational book, which you're doing because the Common Core says you should, now you've done your science, right? And that's a giant problem for kids learning how to do science.
I think that's where your principal question, I think a lot of their heads are, well, they're going to get it if we read about it in our literacy block.
Right.
So we don't need science anymore.
Right. So the content knowledge terminology is a literacy term, right? And it's also non-specific to different content areas, because I think we were trying to promote that social studies would happen too, right? But I completely understand the point, and I think one thing that is embedded in Essential 7, which I'll just move to in 1 second because I'm running out of time, is the doing and discussing of that content area, okay? But at first I just want to show you, because I have a little time here, where to get all of this and more information, okay? So first of all, if you go to literacyessentials.org, you'll find it all. Here are the documents, okay? What I haven't told you about this work, and this is the most important part, is that the devil is in the details, right? So you could read this checklist, or teachers will read this checklist, or schools or administrators, and go just read the big green bold part and say, yeah, we do that, we do that, we do that, okay? But when we talk about the literacy essentials to reading coaches, we have a 4-day training on what's in here. Okay, and that's for coaches who are already really knowledgeable about literacy. So it didn't seem effective to be able to do a full 4-day training with all teachers in Michigan. And so the state of Michigan and all these organizations have worked together to put together modules for teachers. So teachers can go online, they can get sketches for this, okay? And they can do on like one essential, supporting literacy motivation, okay? And they can do this module on that particular essential. And then there are also sample videos, classroom videos associated with those essentials that are available on YouTube. It's really important though that these essentials are part of the modules. Okay, so we have made them available so people like me who are teacher educators who are sharing some of the module information orally can still use them as examples, but the modules are where the how to view them is hidden. So they are very out of context if you just use only that without having viewed the module. Okay, so we have made them available, but hesitantly, because you can nitpick any video of any teacher's classroom for something. And these are lovely teachers all over the state who volunteered to share their practice the best they can. They're produced to try to show something about what's in the documents, but what we'd hate for them to become is the way of doing the thing in the document. Does that make sense? Like that you must do what's in this teacher's class or else, okay? So that's where all the information is in great detail. We're up to 1 through 6. The pre-K essentials 1 and 2 are dropping this week. I've gotten to visit lots of teachers all around the state and be part of the videos for their classrooms. Okay. So I just want to, I'm not going to have a ton of time because you said 1:45 and we've gotten into a lot of conversation.
Go a little further, that's fine.
Okay. So I'm going to just switch back.
We have until like 1:55.
Okay. Well, okay. So that's the part I had kind of planned to talk about today, and then I was going to let you explore the document and find some of the other places to talk about. But based on our conversation, I just want to share a couple of other things. Okay. I can see it, you can't. Sorry, don't know why. All right, let me just try again. Okay, so that's where all the information is, so you can kind of dig in a little bit more. Then I'm going to kind of skip to one of them, which is Essential 7, because I know it has that content knowledge phrase, so now I'm a little afraid to share it. But it has intentional and ambitious efforts to build vocabulary and content knowledge is number 7, right? So it's this number 7, the intent of this, while not specific to one particular discipline, is the idea that learning in the content areas and as well as building vocabulary knowledge around that learning and to use to talk about that learning is really important for kids' literacy outcomes, okay? And here's my jokey thing. It says, my teacher said the school has tough new standards and I need to improve my vocabulary. What's vocabulary? Okay. And I just want to take a second because I work on a team and we're half science educators and half literacy educators, and we get in lots of discussions and debates about vocabulary, okay? Because literacy educators are thinking about texts, right? And as you all experienced, when you read that text, it's pretty difficult to understand the text unless you have deep knowledge of the concepts and in that text and the words that represent those concepts, okay? Science educators, with very good reason, similar to you're learning science if you're reading a text, you're learning science if you put those words on, these science words on the word wall, is equally problematic, right? Again, for very good reason, because just putting some words on a wall or giving you a definition from a dictionary has no indication that you have any of the conceptual knowledge associated with it, right, or the learning from experience. So I just want to say that in my short amount of time, that when we talk to people about vocabulary and what we mean by it here, okay, is not a dictionary definition. I usually go through and I make everybody tell about the vocabulary that they experienced when they were in school, and everyone gets to, we have a little therapy, where everyone experienced the terrible things that were done to them, right? Like memorize the flashcard, look in the back of the science chapter and copy out the definition. I had to do that every week, right? So many more, like the horror show of stories I've heard from people. And I always say, like, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about giving kids words to discuss ideas, okay? So we're talking about when you know what a word means, you might know figurative and figurative meaning, multiple meanings in different contexts, like the front in weather means something different to the front of the line that you're pushing to be in if you're in kindergarten, okay? And usually what I show is this, right? So literacy researchers who study vocabulary, we think of the word and the dictionary definition, but especially the word label, as the tip of the iceberg. In other words, I can say the word molecule and have absolutely no idea what it means, but I can say it. It's a label, right? But whether or not I have any conceptual knowledge or understanding or experience with what that label represents is, right? It's the same way that kids say dada, and they mean all, and they start saying dada to every single man they see at first, right? You have a label and you're trying to understand the concept that that label represents. And so over time and over learning, the conceptual knowledge associated with the label grows and develops. So here's an example, right? Here's a word, right? And some kindergarten children might know that word and they might say it means rain, or it means rain and snow, okay? But when we think about an adult and the conceptual knowledge associated with this word, they might know things like, you know, types of precipitation, right? That it's water released from the cloud, things about evaporation and condensation and water vapor and cloud droplets, and ways humans deal with precipitation, and ways of measuring precipitation, and other meanings of the word precipitation, like sudden haste, or the creation of a solid from a solution, right? So I just want to be really clear that when we talk about Essential 7, one of the biggest things we're talking to teachers about is that we're not talking about this thing where you just stick a bunch of words on the word wall and or you make kids memorize a bunch of definitions. We're talking about learning new words to represent ideas and to help make sense of ideas during content area learning or during book reading. Come on. People get really mad at me about vocabulary, so this is your moment.
Maybe that's why I was zeroed in on mine.
What?
You think Mary was baiting us with this? Is that what it was?
That's okay. That's okay. No, so I want to share that I don't have a ton of time to do all this, but
I think one issue, I'll go ahead and throw it.
yeah, do it.
So I think one issue for us is
Yes.
Often, you know, like your learning the read thing, often people put vocabulary up front.
That's
without
right.
The contextual understanding.
That's right.
And actually that's been promoted quite a bit by other research.
Right.
You know, when our administrators get
Yep.
these books from.
Yep. So, yep, I think that's right.
One of the things that we're trying to push is this discovery.
Right.
And then a need for words.
Right.
And that's where you
Right.
attach them.
So this article that I'm so glad to have is one Amelia and I wrote for Science and Children just last year, okay? And it's talking about just exactly that. Like this, is the question which comes first? Is there always a right answer to which comes first? Or does it depend on your lessons and your particular instructional goals, right? So that's what we get into here, because I think this previewing of all the words for the unit, it's not effective from a literacy instruction, vocabulary instruction perspective, or from a science perspective, okay? Because when we think about and I didn't get into this, but when we think about what makes kids learn and retain words, if that was our goal, okay? If your goal was just vocabulary, and I'll tell you why I don't think that should ever be the goal in a second. If your goal was vocabulary for vocabulary's sake, there's evidence that kids don't actually learn or retain vocabulary unless it's in a meaningful context. So that's a perfect argument for what you're saying, because if you're previewing a bunch of words, memorize these words, there's no meaningful context to understand those words, and kids will not retain them, and they will not be able to use them, okay? So that's the same argument that you're making, but yes, curricula put the list there and sometimes encourage this previewing of the words. And the other thing I would say back to administrators who are saying that is that again, and I'm a vocabulary researcher, so you can send them to me, vocabulary is never the goal. I mean, we all want to know a lot of words, and that's fun if you have one of those word of the day things and you're like, ooh, I know that one. But I mean, that is not ever the purpose, right? We're interested in vocabulary, or I'm interested in vocabulary for 3 reasons, right? Because having great words to use helps you understand text, right? If you're interested in reading comprehension. Having great words to use helps you to be a better writer. You can communicate better if you have the language you need. And having great words to use helps you to explain your thinking, right? Sometimes you could have to say things in like 3 sentences, or you could say the one accurate word for it. So ultimately, the purpose of teaching vocabulary is to support reading, writing, thinking, learning, right? Not because we like words. So I think that preview the words, memorize the word thing, it's back to the big 5 from the National Reading Panel that sort of said if you know vocabulary, you'll be a good reader. But it's not actually a good productive way to think about vocabulary instruction in any learning.
I'm curious how this fits with some of the work looking, well, for the particular assessment called NTPA.
Okay.
Really evaluates how teachers, in our case, student teachers, purposely develop the children's use of academic language.
Right.
And it kind of, the history of it was really interesting. It was developed, as I understand it, it was told to me on the ground, it was developed in California, and that was a real focus because of English language learners. And then they discovered nobody's a native speaker of biology.
That's right.
And so the techniques to develop academic language in the classroom for the students was useful for all students.
Right.
And so that's been an interesting way to think about it as you're moving forward. And I like that. I totally misread it, and it goes to that context. I read how can pre-service teachers talk about represent their use of academic languages. Oh, are they writing up their teaching in ways that is teaching jargon?
Teaching jargon. Okay.
And then, so I totally missed the whole day I spent in the workshop totally learning the wrong thing.
Right.
And then I figured out it was the discipline, the specific academic language.
Right. And again, right, and I would say with K2 kids, most kindergarten through 2nd grade teachers, kindergarten through 2nd grade children, I have a 2nd grader at home, not only do they not speak biology, they don't speak most literature, right? They have oral everyday English that goes on in their community and their family, which is wonderful, and they're able to express lots of ideas. But one of our jobs in school is, as they develop new ideas and new learning, is to help to map that, the bottom of the iceberg, onto some of the labels that are going to let them read and engage in some more sophisticated conversations of that discipline, right? Whatever that may be. That includes when we teach vocabulary in literature, right? There are words that come up a lot in literature that don't come up in everyday language, like fatigued for tired, right? And in this case, they understand the bottom of the iceberg, right? They all know what tired feels like, but they don't know the word fatigue. So we can help them to map a more sophisticated word onto a concept they already know, okay? And so what I would argue is that the debate of what comes first, the words or the concept, is not the right, it's like not the right debate to be having. I think a better debate is how do we make sure that kids learn the ideas and concepts we want them to learn, and then support their language development in meaningful contexts, okay? So if anyone wants to argue to me that previewing a bunch of words and then sticking them on a word wall is a meaningful context, they can come and have a big debate with me, okay? But I would advocate that once you are engaging in the explorations that you're doing, I wouldn't withhold language from kids until they have a fully developed concept, right? You would never withhold, I always say this, like, so sometimes we say until they truly, fully understand this concept, we won't give them the word. Like until they really get what a molecule is, don't say molecule. Right? And that is sort of a extreme take on the other direction, right? Which is like withholding word labels that might be useful because they don't have a fully developed understanding yet. So I think we have to understand that kids might have a label, before they know it's a particular person, not all men. Kids might have molecule before they fully understand molecule. But we have to understand that just because they say a word doesn't mean they have a fully developed concept, but also they might have a great understanding of a concept and not know the word, right? And then we can help them out so they don't have to use 5 sentences to say something that they could say in one more sophisticated word, okay? So I think thinking about word learning in meaningful context, thinking about the learning goals and what is the language the kids would need to make sense of what it is that they're learning and discuss what they're learning. That should be the guide of the decision, sort of when to drop a new word on kids, and not first, second, third. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay. And the more we can start to talk to teachers in that more nuanced way, I think it's better, right? Because again, until we can offer something different, those word wall words are going on the science word wall before there's any teaching about science, right? And the same is true in literacy instruction. They get these lists of words from their curriculum. It's like 5 words a week. They're these weird random words with no meaningful context. And I've done studies on this in literacy curriculum where I analyzed the words the curricula say to teach. They're out of context. They're not meaningful. The expectation that kids might retain to use those words for reading, writing, speaking, or learning in any way is just...
But does it help the SAT score? That's what right.
So, can you probably cram for the SATs? Yeah, you can probably cram for the SATs, but does that have any use for you beyond the SATs? Probably not,
I would say
right?
that won't even help because they're all multi-meaning words. They're not really necessarily difficult words. That part of the SAT's gone.
It did work for the GRE.
Right. Go ahead, Brandy.
But I don't agree with them. Now
I know, you're not.
I just think if we're going to tell teachers don't just throw the words up on the word wall, then what suggestion do we give them? Because I took a statistics class and the vocabulary I realized was really tripping me up. I couldn't keep it straight in my mind what this was and this was, right, Jill? And I had to put them someplace.
Right. So, okay. So, Brandy, I'm not saying don't put them on the word wall. I'm saying if I had given you all the statistics terms on a sheet and said memorize them with their definitions before you learned how to do statistics, would that have been useful to you at all?
No, I just wondered, is there a more effective
So a more effective way, okay, yeah, so a more effective way would be to add the words as you engage in the learning. So as kids...
It's called the tri-square.
Right. Maybe a little more than that, right? Like maybe, right? So as you engage in the learning, whether it's reading a book or engaging in exploration of some sort, right? That as you notice things, you would map on the appropriate word. And that wouldn't even be enough, right? Because as you experience those things over and over again, starting to use the language in real and meaningful ways is how we learn. Okay, go ahead.
In our trainings, we talk about clues charts,
Yep.
summary tables,
Right.
making sure it's added into the
Yep.
revised models.
Yep.
And so the students are using the words with intentionality.
There.
And
Right.
to me, that's about building, if I had those learnings as a student, building in those
Right.
like tricks
Right.
that I could use to help me
Right.
build my learning.
But what we don't want to see is the teacher puts up the clues chart that she plans to teach before the...
It's listening. What's
Right,
the problem?
right. But that is, I think what these folks are saying is that is what is happening, right? That's happening in a lot of classrooms, whether it's write out the definition or these are the words and they go up on the chart and we never revisit them and we make everyone memorize some sort of definition. Okay, go
I was
ahead.
just going to add that I think it's important to think about what are the words that we want kids to know
Yes,
too.
okay.
Because we have a tendency to add more than we need.
So I think, I'm not sure I would agree on that because I don't think there's ever too many words for your life, right? There's so many to learn. But I think what we expect kids to know and what we're just exposing them to are two different things. And when so this document steals from Common Core. I can stop anytime of answering questions. You're in charge. You stop me.
Go ahead.
Okay, so this document, Common Core says to focus more intentional instruction on what they call Tier 2 and Tier 3 words, okay? And here's what those are. These come from some literacy researchers who study vocabulary, and they made sort of a heuristic for teachers to think about. So they said Tier 1 words are sort of everyday speech, and those don't need a lot of intentional focus or instruction in a classroom, but that's not always the case, right? If you have people who are learning the language, of course they need to learn that, and I would argue for very young children, like the ones I work with, they often need to learn everyday words because they don't know them yet, okay? General academic words are words that occur frequently in text, okay, and there are lists of those. There are also just those sophisticated words like fatigued for tired, okay? And the last thing they put in there is discipline-specific words, which are the idea of Tier 3 words, okay? I take a lot of issue with this. It made it into our document because it's what Common Core says. And my issue with it is this. I'll give you, here's a word for you, egg, E-G-G, okay? Is it tier 1, an everyday word that I shouldn't teach? Is it tier 2, a general academic word? Or is it tier 3, a discipline-specific word? Anyone disagree? Okay, so how's it a tier 1 word?
It's common experience for most people.
Because many people have had an egg McMuffin or they have an egg in their fridge. Okay, how's it tier 2? Give me a tier 2 version of egg where I would have to work with kids around this word.
Like in the third life cycle.
So in this case, they'd probably put that into tier 3 because it's something discipline specific, right? But yes, bird life cycle, right? Kids don't know what egg is in life cycle. And tier 2, how about he egged his friend on, right? So that's a kind of way that word would show up in literature or text, and kids would have no idea what it meant. So I would want to support their understanding of what it means to egg your friend on, right? So some of this decision making about words is what, again, I'm going to go back to, what's your instructional purpose, right? And what are the words kids need to make sense of whatever activity you're doing, but also across your unit, right, of what they're supposed to learn, and to talk about their learning, right? And or to understand the text they're reading or across texts. Okay. So which words to focus on what matters is, again, your instructional goals. Okay.
We should
There you
probably
go.
hold off there. Although
Yeah.
I'm sure there's a lot more awesome information.
Yes,
for you
I
to
would be
share.
happy to answer. And you guys can email me all your vocabulary questions and concerns and hate mail.
Oh, come on now.
Can we get
We're
your
good. I told you this in front of the audience.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Can we get your PowerPoint?
Yes. 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 So what do I do? Drag it in that Dropbox?
You can just send it to me.
Okay.
And or you can, do you have the agenda?
Yeah.
I have the Dropbox that everything got put in. So there's a Dropbox. I'll put it in the Dropbox. I'll just edit it to what we actually talked about. Okay.
So, Tanya, thank you.
Sure.